So when we think of campaigns of the 19th century, we think of long wars that often took weeks, months, sometimes years to be decided. But today's story doesn't take months, it doesn't take weeks, it doesn't even take days. In fact, the war we're talking about today was over in about half the length of a football match. Yep, that's soccer for my American viewers. It was a very one-sided contest. So to keep up the football analogy, it was like Manchester City playing in the FA Cup against a team like Forest Green Rangers. Apologies to Forest Green Rangers. Here at Redcoat History, we often look at the big campaigns, the big battles, those that really made the British military have to work its socks off. Well, today we're looking at one on the completely other end of the scale. It's a minor campaign and mainly naval in its conduct, but with some very interesting stories. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the shortest war in history, the Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896. Let's get stuck in. So we're going to take a look firstly at the causes of the war, then the forces involved, and then we're going to briefly examine the fighting that actually happened. The conflict is largely a naval battle and bombardment. Yep, I know that's a little bit outside my wheelhouse, but bear with me, I'm going to try my best. I'm sure I'll be pulled up for using the wrong terminology, so apologies in advance to all you Jack Tars. But while this channel does normally talk about the army, give me a chance because I think this is a fascinating story and one you're going to really enjoy. And don't worry, at least one army officer does make an appearance, and an important one. Is very interesting. So before we get into the brief conflict itself, let's take a look at the background. Zanzibar is an island in the Indian Ocean just off the coast of East Africa. Today it forms part of the Republic of Tanzania or Tanzania, depending on how you say it. But it is still semi-autonomous, which points to an interesting history of past independence. In fact, at one point, much of what now forms the coastline of Tanzania was part of the Sultanate of Zanzibar. Prior to that, it had links to the Sultanate in Oman, but we're not going to get into that now. Given its geographically important location, it was inevitable that the European powers of the time would start sniffing around. The Portuguese Empire had had a strong influence in the area, though they hadn't really had any real power around Zanzibar since the 17th century. Of course, though, they had colonised what we now call Mozambique slightly further to the south, so they were still in the neighbourhood. And contact with the British during this period was inevitable due to its geographical location on the trade route between Britain and India. And it's worth remembering that even after the opening of the Suez Canal in late 1869, the trade route around the Cape of Good Hope was still important. British influence in Zanzibar began to grow for two reasons. Firstly, of course, were the continued efforts of the British government and the Royal Navy to stamp out the slave trade that was still going on in parts of the world. Zanzibar had been a major slave trading centre, and it's said that it made up at least a third of the Sultanate's income. In 1822, the reach of Zanzibar's slave trading was reduced by the British due to the Moresby Treaty, which placed restrictions upon where slave trading could take place. In the 1840s, further restrictions were imposed by the British, and whilst slavery was still legal in Zanzibar, the trade had been reduced. In 1873, the Sultan of Zanzibar was forced by the British to end the import of slaves, and the slave market at Stonetown was closed. Although this inevitably led to an increase in the illegal slave trade, in a way it made it easier for the Royal Navy patrols, as now any ship engaging in slavery was a target. Now, I did say there was a second reason that the British were very interested in Zanzibar, and that was to keep out those other great European powers, particularly those dastardly Germans who were sniffing around the area. Clearly, Zanzibar could form an important naval base for a rival power, and should there be a great European war, obviously it would mean they could get in the way of British trade coming from the Hope up to India and vice versa. So it mattered. Now bear with me because things are a little bit complicated. I'm still trying to get my head around it myself, but let me try and explain. German influence and territorial claims in East Africa brought them into conflict with Zanzibar, as at that stage they still controlled parts of the East African mainland. Now, this was a problem as Zanzibar was nominally under British protection, with a British resident minister heavily influencing the Sultan, and the military led and organised by British officers. More about them later. But despite this, of course, there was reluctance to be dragged into any conflict with the sausage munchers. Anyway, Anglo-German clashes over Zanzibar were largely resolved by what was called the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty of 1890. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue there, does it? Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty. Okay, I think we've got it. In short, the British and Germans did a deal. Heligoland is a tiny island in the North Sea, 30 miles off the German mainland. It was occupied by the British in 1807 during the Napoleonic Wars and then ceded formally to the British in 1814. So Heligoland was given to Germany. The treaty also confirmed the borders between German and British colonies in Western East Africa, and lands were transferred to secure this, partly so the British could build a railway to Lake Victoria. In return, the Germans agreed not to interfere in Zanzibar, and the British protectorate over the island was formally established. Now, needless to say, Zanzibar wasn't really consulted in the matter, but it seems that the Sultan at the time wasn't too disheartened because it brought stability and financial income to his kingdom. In 1890, Ali bin Said became the Sultan of Zanzibar. He banned the domestic slave trade but not slave ownership and appointed Lloyd Matthews as First Minister to lead his government. The British were also guaranteed a veto over the future appointment of a Sultan. Now, Lloyd Matthews is an interesting character. Let's dive into him briefly. He was actually a former Royal Navy lieutenant and had seen service in the Third Anglo-Ashanti War of 1873–74. Later, whilst serving with the Royal Navy as part of anti-slavery operations in East Africa, he had started to drill and train troops raised from freed African slaves to support such operations. In 1877, he had been seconded to the Sultan's service to help raise and train troops for his army. Eventually, he had commanded a force of about 1,000 regulars and about 5,000 irregulars. As First Minister, it goes without saying that he was certainly the power behind the throne. Now, given the name of this channel, I'm sure you were waiting patiently for a redcoat to crop up in our story. Well, now he finally does. Meet Arthur Edward Harrington Raikes. Raikes was the son of a clergyman and was commissioned into the army at the age of 21. He joined the Duke of Wellington's Wiltshire Regiment. But he was clearly born lucky because it wasn't long before he succeeded Lloyd Matthews as head of the military. Although only a lieutenant in the British Army, get this, he was appointed as a brigadier general in the Sultan's army. That's some promotion. Now, I know a lot of you are ex-forces. Have you ever heard of anything like that? Lieutenant to brigadier general in one short move. So a quick break for some housekeeping, guys. If you want to sign up for my mailing list, get your monthly newsletter and a free copy of my ebook all about the Battle of Isandlwana, then please go over to redcoathistory.com/newsletter, fill out your details, and I'll send those over. And then finally, and just quickly, I want to talk about the Victorian Military Society, or VMS, which celebrates its Golden Jubilee this year. It was founded in 1974 to foster interest in military aspects of the Victorian period. When you join the VMS, you get the brilliant magazine, Soldiers of the Queen. Now, they've got a big event coming up on Saturday, the 14th of September. That's called Army, Empire and Cinema, and it's happening at the National Army Museum in London. It marks the 50th anniversary of the founding of the VMS and the 60th anniversary of the premiere of the film Zulu. Yep, you all know I love that film. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, just go to victorianmilitary.org and then you can follow the links to sign up for the VMS or to get tickets for their 50th anniversary event. Okay, so we've looked at a bit of the background, but how did the shortest war in history actually come about? Well, the nature of being a British protectorate depended to an extent on the goodwill of the Sultan. To that end, as I mentioned earlier, it had been agreed that the succession of any new Sultan required British approval. When Sultan Hamid bin Tuwaini died suddenly on the 25th of August 1896, the throne was seized by his cousin, Saeed Khalid bin Bargash. As usual, apologies to anyone who's upset or offended by my poor pronunciation. I'm not an Arabic speaker. Feel free to moan about it in the comments. Now, accounts of the new Sultan's exact age vary. Some say he was 22, others that he was the grand old age of 29. Either way, he was clearly very young and ambitious. Now, there are several things that need explaining. Firstly, it has long been suspected that Khalid had poisoned his cousin so he could take the throne. We can't know that for certain, but many historians do consider that highly likely. Secondly, it's clear that he moved very quickly to take over the throne before the late Sultan's brother could get there and take it ahead of him. That move was, of course, a contravention of the Protectorate Agreement with the British, which gave them the right to choose the successor. The exact role of German officials in nearby Tanganyika isn't entirely clear either. Were they involved? Theories range from them actively supporting the new Sultan to just not actively opposing him. The former would clearly have been a violation of the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty. At first, Britain's response was diplomatic and classically British. Khalid was told to think very carefully about his actions. Classic fiery diplomatic language at its best. Well, Khalid did think about it and decided to continue anyway. By the end of the day, he'd mustered over 2,500 men to come and support him. Most were civilians rather than soldiers, and were people who were upset about British influence. Join the queue, lads. However, some, probably about 700 of them, were experienced soldiers from the Sultan's army. They were all armed with a mixture of modern rifles and old-fashioned muskets. They also had artillery. Their artillery was also a mixed bag, from 17th century bronze cannons to modern German 12-pounders. They even had a Gatling gun, ironically a gift from Queen Victoria. And it's said they might have had some Maxim machine guns, although accounts vary on that subject. They also possessed a steamship called HHS Glasgow, not HMS, HHS Glasgow. Now, contrary to what you might see in some accounts, this wasn't the former Royal Navy frigate HMS Glasgow, which had actually been broken up in 1884. However, the Zanzibar ship HHS Glasgow was based upon its Royal Navy namesake. The story goes that the then Sultan of Zanzibar had been so impressed when HMS Glasgow had visited Zanzibar that he'd ordered a royal yacht / flagship based upon this design. However, it's said that he was unimpressed when he finally got the ship because it wasn't as powerful as its namesake. Also, by 1896, the ship was obsolete, armed with muzzle-loading 9-pounders and a Gatling gun. The British in turn started to muster their own forces. First along was 900 Zanzibari askaris who had stayed loyal to them. They were then supported by about 150 naval personnel and Royal Marines who were actually on board ships in the harbour. The ships were HMS Philomel, a third-class cruiser of the Pearl class, armed with 8 4.7-inch quick-firing guns, 8 quick-firing 3-pounder Hotchkiss guns, 2 14-inch torpedo tubes, and several machine guns. She was supported by HMS Thrush, a Redbreast-class gunboat with 6 4-inch breech-loading Mark II guns, 2 quick-firing 3-pounder Hotchkiss guns, and 2 machine guns. That evening they were joined by a third ship, HMS Sparrow. She sported the same armament as her sister ship. The following morning, the 26th of August, another ship, HMS Raccoon, joined them. She was an Archer-class torpedo cruiser. She had some serious armament, 6 breech-loading 6-inch guns, 8 quick-firing 3-pounder Hotchkiss guns, and loads of other stuff. Then that afternoon, HMS St George, an Edgar-class cruiser of over 7,000 tons, arrived. Imagine that now, the British Navy being able to call upon so many vessels and so much firepower in a remote corner of the world at such short notice. Oh, if only. HMS St George was the flagship of Rear Admiral Sir Harry Rawson, who now took overall command of the squadron. He held the somewhat unusual official title of Commander-in-Chief of the Cape of Good Hope Station and West Africa Station. Something of a mouthful, which for obvious reasons was usually shortened to just C&C Cape. Rawson was the closest senior man to the scene. He was also an experienced commander, having served during the Second Anglo-China War and the Anglo-Egyptian War. Shortly after Rawson's arrival on the afternoon of the 26th of August, a telegram was received from Lord Salisbury, Prime Minister, and also Foreign Secretary, authorising Cave and Rawson to take action. It read, "You are authorised to adapt whatever measures you may consider necessary and will be supported in your action by Her Majesty's Government. Do not, however, attempt to take any action which you are not certain of being able to accomplish success." Or in other words, don't mess it up. Even after getting this telegram, Cave still attempted to negotiate with Khalid, but he wasn't having any of it, and it failed. The military option now seemed the only one available. Britain in those days understood that, despite the flowery language, sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do. No pussyfooting around. An ultimatum was issued to Khalid. Pull down your flag and leave the palace by 0900 the following morning. In other words, surrender. Early that following morning, Khalid did try to negotiate, but he'd left it too late, and Cave told him there was no other option now but for him to surrender. There was nothing left to negotiate. Just before the expiry of the ultimatum, Rawson signalled his squadron to prepare for action. The European women and children were evacuated to HMS St George, and the troops on the ground prepared to follow up the bombardment by the warships. The scene was now set for the conflict to begin. At 0900 hours, Rawson ordered the squadron to open fire. And the naval gunnery was immediately on the money. The first shot fired took out one of Khalid's 12-pounders. Now that's good shooting. The Glasgow opened fire on HMS St George, and Lieutenant Stoddard, commanding HMS Thrush, turned his guns to attack the Glasgow, which was quickly sunk, perhaps reinforcing the former Sultan's low opinion of the vessel as a warship. The crew surrendered by striking their own colours and running up the Union flag. That's what I like to hear. Rawson, obviously a good old-fashioned British lad, ordered the crew of the Thrush to rescue the Glasgow's crew. HMS Thrush also sunk 2 armed launches that the Zanzibaris were using. In total, the British force fired about 500 shells and thousands of rounds of small arms ammunition. The palace was all but destroyed, Khalid's artillery wiped out, and it said about 500 of his supporters were killed. That's a high percentage. The British suffered 1 casualty on board HMS Thrush. It said he was severely wounded, but he did eventually make a full recovery. While all this does lead us to the obvious conclusion that it was an easy war for the British, we do need to make a note of the number of times the British ships were actually hit. The 3 smaller vessels, Sparrow, Thrush and Raccoon, bore the brunt of the attack. Due to their shallow draft, manoeuvrability and speed, they were employed closer inshore than the 2 larger warships, Philomel and St George. Thrush was hit 12 times and George a surprising 62 times. But while some repairs were needed, the damage wasn't too severe. On land, there hadn't been much fighting. Khalid's men had fired at the British land force as it approached the palace, but to little effect. Also, in fairness, there was no real need for Raikes to launch a full frontal assault. He could just sit back and wait for the naval guns to do their job, and just mop up any survivors that were left afterwards. At around 0945, some say 0940, the British had ceased firing on the fall of Khalid's standard. Now, let's get one thing out of the way, the timing of the conflict. You'll see some sources say that the war lasted 45 minutes, others that it was over in 38 minutes. Either way, the 7 minutes doesn't affect its status as the shortest war in history. Now, this discrepancy is partly due to how you define the start and finish times. Technically, you could say the war started when the ultimatum expired at 0900 hours. However, of course, there was a delay between that expiry and the British warships actually opening fire. So you could argue that the conflict actually began when the first shots were fired at 0903. Similarly, regards to the end of the conflict, times do differ, but only by a few minutes here and there. So with the war over, landing parties were sent ashore to help to restore and maintain order. A few weeks later, Sikh troops from India arrived just to finally put a lid on things. Khalid and about 40 of his followers, interestingly, fled to the relative safety of the German consulate. Exactly at what point they did this isn't clear. Some people think they may have left for the consulate almost immediately after the firing began. Despite requests from the British to hand him over, the German consulate staff pointed out to the British that their treaty excluded handing over political prisoners. Ironically, this clause had been inserted by the British themselves. The Germans, however, were keen not to antagonise the British and quickly moved Khalid on board one of their ships that was in harbour over to Tanganyika, German East Africa. Khalid settled in Dar es Salaam, where he was treated with the privileges of a royal in exile. During World War I, he was captured by the British, and guess where he was sent? St Helena. Can you think of anyone else who might have been sent to St Helena? Let me know in the comments. In the mid-1920s, he was allowed to return to East Africa, and he died in Mombasa in 1927. In the aftermath of the war, the British, understandably I guess, tightened their grip on the new Sultan and limited his powers. In fact, it's been suggested that the only reason for not making Zanzibar a formal colony was that it was cheaper to rule indirectly through the figurehead of the Sultan. A few months after the end of the war, all forms of slavery were now entirely abolished in Zanzibar. So what can we learn from this curious little campaign? Well, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, it really shows you the reach and the power that the Royal Navy had in those days. But it also marks the end of what we think of as gunboat diplomacy. And what of the war itself? Well, although it was very short and perhaps appears a bit one-sided, it would be wrong not to recognise the professionalism of the British forces involved. Yes, there was a massive disparity in the forces involved, but how often on this channel alone have we discussed times where the superior, more technologically advanced military has been beaten? So never take anything for granted. Special thanks to Dr. Chris Bryce for helping to research and co-write this episode. I'll put a link to his books down in the description below. I'll be back next week with more fascinating stories from British military history. Be sure to comment, like and subscribe. Let's keep the channel growing. Thanks guys.